Runway 3, clear to land, caution for the cross on 1206.
Okay, clear to land, runway 3, step charge good.
10-5 to Tango, the Cessna's 11 o'clock, 2.5 miles, slightly higher.
Everything taught in this series is intended for virtual aviation only. While I attempt to replicate real-world procedures on my channel, and so do many of you, I am not a certified flight instructor. If you want to learn to fly in the real world, you must attend a flight training program with a certified flight instructor. This series will attempt to teach and replicate real-world procedures, but is not a substitution for real-world training with a certified flight instructor. You have been warned. Hello YouTube, Captain Mac here, and welcome to our first ever episode in virtual flight school. Now this series will aim to capture real-world lessons for the flight simulation environment, starting at the private pilot level and going all the way through commercial pilot. It is my hope to capture all of the basics of flying, including flight planning, ground operations, ATC communication, navigation techniques, and more. As mentioned in the opening disclaimer, this series is not a substitute for real-world training, and I am not a certified flight instructor. Now, whether you've been flying in flight simulators for decades or you're just starting out, I'm confident that you will find useful information throughout this series. With all of that in mind, today we're going to be talking about ground operations. Specifically, we'll be covering the various taxiway markings, airport signs, and the runway markings. We're going to go over what they look like, what they mean for you as the virtual aviator. We'll also be covering airport lighting to include taxiway lighting and runway lighting. So strap yourself in. Grab a cup of joe and sit back because we got a lot of ground to cover. See what I did there? Now most of you are like me. When you first jumped into a flight simulator, you wanted to do this and this, but you didn't know anything about this or this. After today, you will have a solid understanding of the various markings around the airfield, what they mean for you. Now I may miss one or two, but I promise that I won't miss the most important ones. Shall we begin? Now those of you with a keen ear may have noted that that first portion was scripted. And the reason it was scripted is because I tried about a dozen times to get that introduction right, and I just couldn't seem to nail it. So I wrote it down, and I read what I wrote down, and I think it came out all right. The rest of this really isn't scripted. I'm just kind of making it up as I go. So hopefully we don't mess it up too much. Now with all that in mind, as I sat around kind of thinking, what's the best way to go about making this series? And specifically, the last couple days I've been thinking, how do I want to start this first video here? And since we're going to be doing airport markings, ground markings, signage, and all of that, it seems to me that the best approach is to start from the approach. So we're going to work our way down the runway markings, and then we will work our way into a parking position and getting a feel for all the different ground markings that are available. And then we're going to come back out here and we're going to look at lighting in a night view so that we can see what that's all about as well. So after a little bit of back and forth and deciding where I wanted to start at, I'm starting here at San Francisco, KSFO, and we're looking at runway 28 left. So as we're coming in for the approach here, the first thing we notice is these yellow chevrons here, and that's what they're called. They're called chevrons. Anytime you see these yellow chevron markings at one end or another of the runway, and on rare occasion you might see them on the side of the runway, they indicate an area that is not suitable for landing, taxi, or takeoff. In other words, your aircraft should never go on to this portion of the runway. In fact, it's not even really part of the runway. It's used typically as an overblast area. So if they didn't have this in here, it's all dirt and grass and it all gets blown backwards, and in this case it would get blown backwards into the ocean, and it was probably an environmental thing here in San Francisco. And they use these in a lot of different areas. As we move down the runway a little bit here, we come to this portion that has this great big arrow here, and then you got several arrows here. Now these are not chevrons, these are arrows. Now These arrows here, a line with an arrow or a traditional looking arrow, indicates a displaced threshold. When you have a displaced threshold, you can take off and taxi on that portion of the runway, but you cannot land on it because it won't handle the weight of the aircraft. Now here in Goodyear, Arizona, or KGYR, you can really see a displaced threshold and what it can look like. So this is a very long displaced threshold in Goodyear, and this area here is suitable for taxi and for takeoff, but it's not suitable for landing. And right now I'm overlaying a video. This was taken a few years ago. This was me landing at KGYR in a Cessna 172. I am a real-world pilot. I have a private pilot's license, not a commercial pilot's license. And again, I'm not a certified flight instructor. But you can really see in this video the length of that displaced threshold. And to top it all off, it was a pretty smooth landing on my part, so I thought I'd show it off a little bit. And jumping back over here to runway 28 left in San Francisco, so you can see once again that this is a very short displaced threshold. So these arrows always indicate a displaced threshold. And when you have these, I guess you could call these chevrons too. I'm not really sure if they do or not. But when you have these white chevrons or white partial arrows, let's call them chevrons. It probably makes more sense. When you have these white chevrons pointed at a line, that line is called the threshold. Now there are runways that do not have a displaced threshold, and when there is no displaced threshold, you usually don't have this line or these chevrons here. You just have the line. Followed immediately after the threshold are the threshold markings, and that's these vertical stripes that you see going across the runway here. Now some folks call these the zebra stripes, but they're actually called the runway threshold markings. They come in basically two configurations. Either there's just 8 stripes across the runway spaced evenly, or the number of stripes will be related to the width of the runway. Now I'm not sure why there would be a difference in that, but basically when you look at the number of stripes here, it can tell you how wide the runway is. For example, if there are 4 stripes, you would have a 60-foot wide runway. 6 stripes would be 75 feet, 8 stripes 100, 12 stripes would be 150, and 16 stripes would be 200 feet wide. What's interesting here, this is the Flight Beam KSFO airport, and if you count these out, you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and you got 7 on this side, which is 14, which is actually incorrect. Right now what you're looking at is a satellite view of runway 28 left from Google Maps or something like that, and you can see that there are actually 16 stripes on runway 28 left, which means it is 200 feet wide. Now as we move down the runway, we have the runway designator. This is what we often call the runway number. In this case it's 28 left. Now the way these numbers are set up, it's the whole number rounded to the nearest 1/10 of the magnetic azimuth of the center line of the runway. Now if you're pulling on your ears right now going, what on earth did you just say? Let me simplify for you. Okay, they round this number based on the compass heading. So 228 runway 28 would be 280 something degrees, and they round it to the nearest 10th. So if it goes beyond 285 degrees, they will round it up to 29. They just remove that last number. And if it's a single digit number, most of the time in the US it will just show one number. Sometimes it'll show 2. And in Europe, I think it almost always shows 2 numbers. So like runway 1 would be 01. And then the L is pretty obvious. It's the designation that this is runway 28 left, and this runway over here would be runway 28 right. That means they both have the same heading within a degree or 2, and that they run parallel to each other. Okay, continuing down our runway, these 3 stripes that you see, or 6 in total, 3 on each side of the center line, are called the touchdown zone markings. Now, the touchdown zone markings are meant to not only identify the touchdown, but they're supposed to be coded to give distance information. Now, to be fair, the FAA website where I pulled the information on this from to make sure I was getting it right, it's not really clear on what that means by these being coded. It says they give information in 500-foot increments. Well, these are 500 foot from the end of the runway, okay? And then the next ones down are 500 foot from those, and we'll get to those in just a minute. So I'm not really sure. It's certainly not 1,500 feet, so you wouldn't say, well, there's 1,500 feet from the runway threshold right here. That wouldn't make any sense. So I'm not really sure what they mean by that, but ultimately that's what these are. Is they're the marking of the touchdown zone. Now from here we can just move right on up, and the next one we have here. Now these are going to be on precision approach runways only. These are a precision approach runway is going to be a runway that has an instrument approach procedure with minimums. So for example, if you look here at Goodyear's runway, there are no markings down that runway. You've got the displaced threshold, you've got the threshold, the runway number, and then that's it. It doesn't even have centerline markings, though I don't recall off the top of my head if it does in the real world. But there are no precision approaches flying into Goodyear. Coming back over here to San Francisco, this is a precision approach, and that's why we have all of these additional markings on our runway. So this here is our touchdown zone marking, and then this is our aiming point marking. Now, the big thick stripe on either side of the center line, that represents a visual aiming point for landing the aircraft, and they're located approximately 1,000 feet from the landing threshold of the runway. So from back here, from this threshold right here to right here is 1,000 feet. Now from there it's 500-foot increments as we continue on down, and these are all aiming point markings. So it goes from the one thick broad stripe to the two narrow stripes, and there's two sets of those, and those are 500-foot increments. So this would be 2,000 feet down the runway, and then you've got a single and another single on each side, and that's another 1,000 feet. So that's 3,000 feet down the runway by the time you get to these here, which is right about where Captain Mack usually lands his aircraft. All right, now we've scooted on further on down the runway here. First of all, let's talk about the center line markings here. Now, not all runways are going to have center line markings, but all precision approach runways will. And while you couldn't see these in the really dark areas in the touchdown zone very well, they do run the entire length of the runway. Additionally, the white solid line on either side of the runway marks the runway edge. All right, so in this case here in San Francisco, you actually have a shoulder on the runway. Not all runways will have a shoulder. This may be where the runway ends. Additionally, you might have a runway that doesn't have an edge marking at all. The runway just ends there and there's no additional asphalt. Now, with all of that being said, here again, for a precision approach runway, the solid white line should run all the way down both sides. Now, as we continue down the runway a little bit here, the first thing we come across is a high-speed taxiway exit. We know it's a taxiway because all taxiways are going to have a solid yellow line that runs down the middle of the taxiway. And the idea is that anytime you are taxiing your aircraft around the airfield, you should remain centered over that taxiway line. Now, there can be a little bit of leeway in there. You don't have to be exactly perfect on it. The only exception to not being centered on the taxiway is if you're leaving the taxiway, which we'll get to in a little bit, or if you have to avoid some sort of obstacle and it's safe to do so. If it's not safe to do so, what you need to do is stop. Now, as we move up a little further here, and I'll go all the way up here, we actually have a regular taxiway exit here. So for people who land the aircraft like Captain Mack, and we can't make those high-speed exits because I land so far down the runway, I would have to exit here. But again, the taxiway is designated by the single solid yellow line that runs down the center of the taxiway itself. Now, moving off to the side of the runway here, we've actually turned our view around so we're facing back toward the runway. And I did that because it makes more sense as we work our way in. I don't want to work our way back out to look at this. What we're looking at here is called a runway hold short line. Okay, and it's designated by 2 solid stripes and then 2 dashed stripes, and they're always going to be yellow. This runway hold short line means that we need to stop on this side. The solid side of the line is where you need to stop and hold short of the runway. Okay, the striped lines can be crossed and should be crossed immediately. They are not a hold short point. We've also got the runway designator painted onto the ground here as well. On our left side is runway 10 right, and on our right side is runway 28 left. That lets us know what runway we're looking at right now. Additionally, to the left of that, you've got this P in a black box. It's a yellow P in a black box with a yellow square. That tells us that we are on taxiway Papa, and we'll get a little bit more into that when we start talking about taxiway signs. The other thing that I want to talk about while we're sitting here is this particular taxiway line. It's the same as the other taxiway lines, except that it has dashed lines on either side of it. This is called an enhanced taxiway center line. All right, and some airports, not all of them, will include these, and basically all it is it starts 150 feet prior to the runway holding position, which is right here. All right, and that just lets you know you're approaching a runway. That's the only reason it's like that. So not all airports are going to have those, but if you see those on the ground, you taxi on them just like you would any other taxiway. But it lets you know that you're coming up on a hold short point. And I'm sort of bumbling through some of this. The other thing I want to talk about while I'm sitting here is this taxiway line. This is not a taxiway center line. This is a taxiway edge line. And the purpose of this line is to let you know that you should not, under any circumstances, taxi your aircraft on this side of the line. You should remain on the side where the center line is located. There are 2 types of runway, or not runway. There are 2 types of taxiway edge lines as well. You've got the double yellow solid striped line like this, and then you've got a dashed double yellow line like you see on the other side of this hold short line. And the dashed line on the edge of a taxiway is the same as a dashed line on the other side of the hold short line. You can cross a dashed taxiway line, but you cannot cross the solid taxiway edge line. Does that make sense to everybody? I think it does. And then these yellow markings here are just additional visual aid information to let you know this is not an area of the taxiway that you should be on. You should be on this side here, and that's why those stripes are only on that side of the taxiway. The last thing I want to mention here, the reason that the hold short line extends way over here is so that an aircraft can get closer to the hold short line and still see that they are behind it. All right, now I jumped over here to JFK really quick to show you another type of hold short line. This is default scenery, so I'm certain that this line is not where it belongs. And you can see that our standard hold short line, it doesn't look quite as good as it did at our add-on scenery at San Francisco. Nonetheless, this still gives us an opportunity to look at this line here. This is called an ILS critical area holding position. Okay, and basically what it comes down to is when the ILS system is in use, it's very sensitive to interference, especially from ground objects, including aircraft. So there may be a time, especially when there's heavy ILS operations, probably in inclement weather, where ATC will give you an instruction to hold short of the ILS critical area. That would mean that you hold short of this line until you're cleared to enter the runway, or you receive the instruction to line up and wait. So those are the 2 different types of hold short lines that you'll find when you come up to the runway. Alright, so through the magic of Flight Simulator, we're back on the other side of the country at San Francisco again, and this time we're looking back away from the runway as if we were just exiting. We've already talked about the taxiway center lines, the solid yellow line, and the enhanced taxiway center line, which is the solid yellow line with dashed lines on either side. Real quickly here, I want to talk about these markings that you see on the ground. These are taxiway indicators, and most of the time you're going to find these on signs, which we'll get to in a little while, and we'll go over them again. But sometimes either at large airports or at a really busy taxiway intersection like you can see here, they'll have them on the ground either to give you additional assistance because the area is so complex. You can see there's a lot of taxiways coming and going here, or because there's just nowhere to put a sign that's useful. So when we're looking at this here, we can see that if we continue straight, well, let's redo this. So we talked about this when we were looking at the runway. The black box with a yellow letter and a yellow border indicates the taxiway that you are on. Okay, and so if we look at this here, it might be a little confusing. Are we on B or are we on Q? Well, because B is set over here, this is the Bravo taxiway. We're on the Quebec taxiway right now. Now with that being said, we've got a whole bunch of other stuff here. When you have a solid yellow box with a black letter and a border and an arrow, it's telling you which taxiway is in that direction. So because this arrow's at an angle, this is telling us that this is the Bravo 1 entrance to the Bravo taxiway. Okay, and if we look over here, we can see here it's saying Bravo 1. And matter of fact, I may have that backwards. So actually I don't have it backwards. It's just kind of weird the way it's set up here. And this is why these markings are like this on the ground. So this is telling us that Bravo 1 is this way. Okay, but this is taxiway Bravo. So why is it Bravo 1? If I zip over here to the other side, I get the same thing. Bravo 1 going this way. So we were just right over here. Now we're over here. This is telling us that Bravo 1 is off to the right. And if we go over there, we have a sign that tells us this is the Bravo taxiway. Now, again, we'll get into signs here in a little bit. They're pretty easy to figure out. But what you can see from this is trying to help alleviate the confusion. And I'm not so sure that it always does. But we do know that Bravo taxiway is here and that this is the Bravo 1 entrance. And this tells us that it's this way as well. And, you know, honestly, the way it's set up, it almost makes it look like this is Bravo 1. Maybe this arrow was supposed to be at an angle. I don't know. We can tell from here that Alpha is this way. And then you see there's actually two signs for Alpha. So you've got, we're on Quebec. Alpha is going to be to our left, but it's also straight. What does that mean? It means that if we continue straight up around this corner, that we're still going to be on Alpha. However, it also means that if we turn left here, we're going to be on Alpha. And that's why it's laid out the way it is. You see that it shows Alpha as being straight and to the left because the Alpha taxiway is this taxiway here. So you can see sometimes these ground markings can get a little confusing, and when we get to the section where we talk about reading the ground charts, that's going to help us to understand the markings on the ground a little bit better as well. Now as we continue to taxi in, and I've turned around and faced the other way, this is the intersection we were just at. So we took a left onto Alpha, and if we swing over to the side here, we can see Alpha continues all the way down, but there's also a bunch of gates right here. We have a taxiway edge marking with a striped line and a solid line. This tells us that we can cross this taxiway edge to move into a parking position. If we cross over and move into this parking position here, we can see at this airport, and this isn't the same for all of them, at this airport the parking position is marked on the ground, and in this case it has this arrow, but it also has a taxiway center line as well. And this lets us know that this is where the aircraft needs to park. Now let's if I can talk. Let's talk about the parking position itself here really quick. You see the double white lines around here? These are related to the aircraft, but they're not for the aircraft. These are actually for all of this ground equipment. Like all these carts should be on the other side of that white line. They're not supposed to be on this side of the white line unless they are loading and unloading baggage and so on. All right. So the idea here is this outlines the wingspan of the largest aircraft that can park there. This is obviously a large or a heavy aircraft gate here. You got the two jetways and so on. And some of these will have outlines in red, what you'll see. And I don't think I've seen any here at San Francisco, but they'll have a red half circle. And that's supposed to mark the danger area for the engines. But not all airports are going to have that. These red squares you see on the ground, these are actually for fuel ports. And then if we zoom in here, you can see that this parking space is actually laid out for several different types of aircraft, and these are for the marshalers to know where to stop the aircraft at. You can't see these while you're inside, but you've got an A319 back here, you've got the E170 and 75, A330 would pull up to here, 340, 777, 767, 787, they're all marked on here, and this is just for the ground crew to get you to stop in the right position. This is one of those areas where GSX does a really poor job, in my opinion, because I think they default to the furthest line forward. Now in default FSX or P3D, your ground markings in your parking area are typically only going to have one line on the end. And it won't be marked with anything. It'll just be a yellow stripe here and the yellow centerway stripe, and that's the parking position. But the different distances for parking, they have to do with the jetways connecting to the aircraft and so on. And we jump over here to a different part of the terminal, and you can see that the gate number is actually listed on a square out here, and that's telling you to turn in here to park at gate 76B. And you can see that it's outlined in white, and then if we were to zoom in over here, we'd see similar markings on the ground. Probably not the 777 or the 747. This parking space isn't big enough for those. But you got the same hash marks over here, which tell the marshaller where to stop the aircraft. And the last thing I want to talk about for ground markings specifically are white lines. Now, you'll see a lot of different types of white lines around different airports. Those relate to ground vehicles. They do not relate to the aircraft. So again, these white lines, while they relate to the aircraft in the sense that they outline the basic wingspan, those are for ground vehicles. It's a warning for them when they drive in this area and there's an aircraft present to be careful. Now, all ground vehicles, with certain exceptions, are supposed to transition back and forth across the airfield using basically these little service roads. And they've got a white solid line on either side, and then they've got a dashed white line down the middle. Sometimes you'll see what they call a zipper. It's a black and white line on the edge of these, and then a solid line on the other side, and that's telling them they can drive off of it on one side but not on the other side. You don't see that here at San Francisco. I haven't seen it anywhere. But again, those relate to ground vehicles. You can see they've got stop positions and stuff like that. And if you happen to, not that you will be, but if you happen to be driving around an airfield, one thing that's really important to always note is, and this is where P3D, GSX, all those, they get it wrong. Aircraft always have the right of way. Aircraft do not stop for vehicles. Vehicles stop for aircraft. So the last thing here, I didn't notice it until just now as I spun around. These blue numbers, blue and white numbers, these indicate ramp positions. So this is 7, this is 7B. Most likely these are start positions where an aircraft is pushed back and then placed next to this designator, 7 or 7B, and then they start up. Or they're used as a ramp locator. So you're going to park at ramp 7B, gate 76B, or that would be 7 actually. You're going to park at ramp 7, gate 76B. Now, there is one last thing I just thought of that is specific here in San Francisco, and it is at other airports as well, but I know they have it here, and that's a designated engine start point. So there's one here. I know there's one on the other side of the 747 there. And basically what it is they're saying that you're not going to start your engines just as you start to push back, right? So when you're pushing back from these gates over here, actually it's kind of weird. I've never been on this side, but you can't, how can you park there? It's got a fence all the way around it. You see that? That's interesting. It's like they're building a new terminal or something. I never noticed that before. But so we'll use these gates on this side. So if you were pushing back from this gate here, you wouldn't start your engines just as you push back. They'd push you back and then they'd pull you forward to here, and then you could start your engines here. And it's the same thing on the other side. There's an engine start point right here. And so for all of these gates, they get pushed back, pulled up around the corner, and then they start their engines here. And so that's not specifically unique to San Francisco, but San Francisco is the only airport I've seen it at. It's not at any of the other. I haven't seen it in at any of the other add-on airports that I have, but there are certainly going to be other airports that are going to have that as well. Now, believe it or not, we'll be done before you know it, but I jumped over here to Phoenix to show you something else, and I found another type of sign that you find on the ground, and that's this approach sign. You see it says 26 approach, and then it's got a runway hold short line. The reason this says 26 approach is because this runway has a displaced threshold. There's no arrow on it. They're not necessary, but you can see the chevrons up here where the threshold begins. So this whole area is a displaced threshold. So since it's not technically a runway for landing, this ground sign is labeled as 26 approach rather than just runway 26. Hopefully that makes sense to everybody. Now, I touched on it briefly already, but I'm going to go into it a little bit more now. We're going to talk about signs. Now, there's different types of, there's only really a couple of different types of signs. You've got your taxiway signs and you've got your runway markers, and I think that's just about it for aircraft. I can't think of any others off the top of my head, but if I come across them, I'll be sure to put them in here. So what we're looking at here, and again, we're in Phoenix, so we're looking at two different taxiways and the same crossover point, right? So you've got the Bravo taxiway here indicated by a black square with a yellow border and a yellow letter. Bravo taxiway. Same thing over here, but it's the Charlie taxiway. And then you've got the Charlie 10 crossover. Now note, it's the Charlie 10 crossover from both sides, not the Bravo 10 from one side and the Charlie 10 from the other. I have seen it done that way, and that can be a little bit obnoxious. Now, with that said, if we move over to the side here, we were just looking at these two signs. You can see that this is Charlie 10, indicated by a black sign with a yellow border and a yellow letter and number. This is Charlie 10, and the taxiway that you're about to go on to, turning left or right, would be the Charlie taxiway. Now, part of the reason I came to Phoenix to do the signs is because Phoenix has really good signage around the airport. So you can see here, this is a runway what do they call it? A runway warning sign or a runway indicator sign? I don't remember off the top of my head. But this is telling us that up here is runway 8 on the left and 26 on the right. It's also telling us that this is the B10 entrance and exit to runway 8 or 26. And because Phoenix does such a good job with their runway markings, you look here and you see that they've got 8 and 26 marked several times and B10 marked at least twice. So there's really no mistaking where you're at when you're in Phoenix. Okay, the last sign I want to talk about is this guy right here, and I don't know the correct or official name for it, but this sign indicates to you how much runway is left. So if you're cruising down the runway after landing, and you're like Captain Mac, where you landed halfway down the runway, and you start to see 3, 2, 1, that's telling you that you're running out of runway room here. And these are numbered in thousands of feet. So from here, there's 3,000 feet of runway left. The next one will be a 2. The one after that will be a 1. And then if you see the 1 and you keep going, you're probably not going to see any more signs. You're going to see some trees instead. At nighttime, I won't show this sign at night, but at night, the 3 or the number in the middle will be lit up with a white light, and it's really clear and it's easy to see. Alrighty, folks, that's going to wrap it up for this one. Originally, this was one video that went all the way through the nighttime lighting as well, but on the suggestion of a good friend of mine, in order to shorten it up, I've separated the daytime ground markings and signs and whatnot from the nighttime lighting. So look for that as episode 2, which will be released at the same time as this one, so it should already be available to you. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you haven't had an opportunity, go ahead and smash that subscribe button. I'd like to get up to 10,000 by the end of the year, and we're getting pretty darn close. We got about 1,500 to go. Be sure to give the video a thumbs up as well. It lets me know I'm doing a good job. And if you don't like the content, you can give it a thumbs down. But please give me some constructive but kind criticism along with it. As I said before, I hope that you guys enjoyed this one, and that's going to wrap it up. That's it. That's all and no more. So, as always, until next time, folks, keep the blue side up, unless otherwise instructed by ATC. God bless you all, and have an absolutely wonderful day.